I'm thrilled to have you all here together with our honored guests. I'm Ted Ruger, the new Dean of the Law School, and I'm very pleased to introduce this event, which is the first of what I hope and expect to be many in our Dean's Distinguished Speaker Series, organized through our International Programs Office and under the tremendous leadership of Rangita De Silva, who is helping really bring some of the world's foremost leaders and officials and lawyers thinking about human rights and trade and other crucial national security issues. So it's my tremendous pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Ivan Šimonović, who's Assistant Secretary of Human Rights at the United Nations, as well as having held a number of other positions I'll allude to briefly. He'll speak to us about one of the most important subjects we could think about now or at any time, namely the role of international institutions, nation states, and the legal profession in promoting basic human rights values around the world. As anybody who glances even at the news through whatever media you access the news with, one message you can't miss is that we live in a time of crisis around the world from an economic and human rights perspective. As we speak today, huge numbers of refugees and migrants around the world are fleeing wars of violence, fleeing persecution, fleeing abject poverty from their home countries, seeking a better life somewhere else in places which have their own and our own problems in terms of kind of operationalizing a true vision of human rights. We hear about the large number of refugees coming from places like Syria, Afghanistan, and Eritrea to Europe. Secretary Šimonović will speak today about problems as well in Africa, in areas like Sudan and Burundi, which have also had tremendous upheaval and producing significant human rights issues. Our speaker is eminently well qualified to address this. One aspect of his biography that I think I would like to celebrate, precisely because he breaks the norm and is actually a law professor who has left the ivory tower and actually is making a difference in the real world. He was a longtime law professor and accomplished scholar and teacher at the University of Zagreb, where he headed up the Department of Legal Theory as well as served as vice dean. He's been assistant professor at Yale Law School and has merged his scholarship and theory with a number of high-level practicing positions where he has and continues to work to operationalize human rights values in the institutions around us. He is currently Assistant Secretary for Human Rights at the UN. Prior to that, he served as Minister of Justice for Croatia, and prior to that, Permanent Representative to the United Nations in New York, and Senior Vice President and President of the Economic and Social Council. I could go on and on with the CV, but you would like to hear him speak. Of particular note, and kind of fusing the legal academic background with the pragmatic realities of working in the world of human rights and in this complex institution of the United Nations, is the way in which Secretary Šimonović is working to operationalize certain doctrinal principles, which I think that he'll talk a bit about, like the human rights upfront idea, which is an idea that the UN as an institution is not just an external monitor of human rights in the countries around the world, but it, in its own organizational forms and functioning, needs to better embody kind of human rights principles in all of its decision-making, not just as a segregated unit or subpart, and I appreciate hearing your thoughts on that. Other doctrinal innovations that Secretary Šimonović is being involved in implementing is one some of you may have heard about, the responsibility to protect doctrine, which is a very powerful theoretical reformulation of the idea of what it means for a state to be sovereign. Sovereignty doesn't merely mean the right to exclude others or exercise territorial control, but the doctrine, the responsibility to protect doctrine would say the state has affirmative obligations to protect those within its borders from and guarantee them freedom from persecution or a variety of other challenges that they would face. This too is something that his office is working to operationalize. So Secretary Šimonović, we're very, very happy to have you here, and we're looking forward to your talk, and thank you in advance for taking questions from the audience. So if you do have questions, we'll have microphones and the opportunity to speak. Please do silence your cell phones at this time and join me in welcoming our speaker.
Dean Ruger, thank you very much for your kind words. Thank you for your invitations. Ms. Rangita De Silva, Associate Dean, I think that your friendship and cooperation with my wife, who is Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, has also contributed to establishing links with the Penn Law. I really am delighted to be here, and it's not courtesy that I am ready to answer your questions. In fact, I intend to have a relatively short presentation and then offer you a la carte instead of fixed menu. But definitely, before that, I would like to raise a couple of questions. First of all, let me give a broader framework for human rights in the United Nations. We consider that United Nations are built on 3 pillars, and it's security, development, and human rights. It was Kofi Annan who once said, there is no peace without development. There is no development without peace. And there is neither of the two without human rights. Let me elaborate a little bit on that. There is no peace without development. It can be empirically proved. If you do a conflict analysis, you will see that especially when internal conflicts are concerned, internal instabilities, the years of lack of development, of bad governance, of corruption significantly increase the likelihood of conflicts. Now let us move to the other statement, that there is no development without peace. It's well known that each conflict leads to destruction of infrastructure, of housing, but it's less visible that it, a part of damnum emergens in sense of civil law, it implies also lucrum cessans, the lack of realization of opportunities that societies could have. For example, such an indirect loss that is less visible are damages to education during the conflicts, and on a long term societies pay that damage as well. And let us now come to the last element of the statement, that there is neither peace nor development without human rights. Recently, during the summit just held a week ago at the margin of the 70th General Assembly, there was an instrument adopted called Sustainable Development Goals as Declaration and Plan of Action. And when I compare this with so-called Millennium Development Goals, one of the greatest differences is the role that is assigned to human rights in the area of development. It is quite explicit that, for example, discrimination of women, prohibiting access to the workforce, and discrimination of people based on their religion, ethnicity, or any other attribute has not only a very harmful social and political consequences, but also economic ones. Let me now move to the center of my presentation today, and it's the relationship between human rights, peace, and security. There is a very tight interrelationship between human rights and all stages of a conflict. So let us start with conflict in making. Quite often it is violation of human rights that are root causes of conflicts. We could use numerous examples. For me, a good example is beginning of the Arab Spring. The picture that, for me, is the essence of the Arab Spring is the picture of a protester carrying a banner with a couple of very simple words, saying, "I am a man." This simple message says for me all, a part of it being not gender neutral, but if we forget about this dimension, what does that mean, I am a man? It means I am a man, but I'm not being treated like a man. My rights are not being respected. I am a man and I claim my rights. I claim my right to have opportunity to work, to have a fair share of national assets. I have a right for my child to get education. I have a right to have access to justice. I have a right to select my own political leadership. I have a right to medical care without the need to pay a bribe, and I have nothing. And this denies me from my rights as a man. And I will raise up, and if necessary I will fight. I will get killed in that fight if I continue to be in a situation that my rights are being denied. But it's not only Arab Spring. Dean mentioned Ukraine. Maidan was exactly that. Maidan was a reaction to deprivation of human rights. Maidan first started as a student and young educated people protest because President at the time, based on his own political calculation, decided to divert from Ukraine's desire to go in the direction of joining the European Union. Then you had protests, but they were not massive. It was only younger intellectuals participating during those protests. But it was met by brutal police force, by beatings, by humiliation, and those violations of rights of people committed by security forces have ignited the real massive, serious Maidan. Now, this is also something that we can see around the world as conflicts in making. They do not yet represent a threat to international peace and security, but tomorrow may if left unaddressed. For example, the situation in Burundi right now is something where violations of human rights are threatening to explode into a serious first civil war, but then with potential spillovers to Rwanda, to DRC, Uganda, and so on. Something similar can be seen in DRC, both in Burundi and DRC. Problem is disrespect of civil and political rights of citizens and having presidents that insist on their terms in office that are unconstitutional. Now, Let me now say something on human rights during the conflict. During the conflict, of course, there are numerous violations of international humanitarian law, of international human rights law, and something that my Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, or let's call it just Human Rights Office, does, is that we try to monitor and report on human rights violations. For example, in Afghanistan, we started early on with casualty reporting. It's not just a body count. It's establishing that civilians are being killed, establishing who is responsible for being, who is responsible for their killing. And I can tell you from personal experience, even hardcore human rights violators such as Taliban in Afghanistan are not immune from criticism based on facts related to killings of civilians. I myself participated in talks with Taliban on issues of killings of civilians, but also warning them about command responsibility for these acts. Command responsibility in sense not only for orders given, but for not preventing and for not punishing. So that monitoring and reporting is a powerful advocacy tool. I myself was in opportunity to talk to, at the time, President of Côte d'Ivoire, Ouattara, when he was under protection of United Nations in Gulf Hotel, when President Gbagbo did not want to leave the office, although Ouattara was elected. And when, up to that moment, only Gbagbo and his supporters were involved in human rights violations of international humanitarian law. But Ouattara's supporters were coming from the north, and I visited the site of first killings of Ouattara's supporters, and I was able to go to him and to tell him that command responsibility from now on will be applied to him as well. The same day, he went to national television and delivered a powerful speech that crimes are crimes, and no matter of the perpetrator, they should be punished. Similar conversations I had in South Sudan with President Kiir and his rival Riek Machar. And finally, in post-conflict period, the relationship with human rights and peace and security is also essential. In every conflict, you have, almost in every conflict, a winning and losing side. And we need some sort of justice. Justice, yes, but retaliation, no. If justice is transformed into a victor's justice, if it ends up that only losing side and its representatives are being prosecuted, we are just having not a sustainable peace, but we are preparing for another cycle of conflict. Now, let me now briefly mention something about recognition of the importance of human rights for peace and security. The Security Council has in its work recognized importance of human rights through a couple of indicators. First of all, there is practically no resolution establishing new mandates of the Security Council, country mandates, without strong human rights provisions, including sometimes provisions on protection of civilians, on responsibility to protect. And other indicator is that when configuring future missions, they almost always have human rights component and the number of staff in human rights components is increasing, and we can follow that trend for years. In implementation of human rights mandates, there is much more robustness in protection of civilians. And I'll give you an example that I'm personally familiar with. In 1993, in Srebrenica, I know our interpreter, UN interpreter there, who had his family in front of our camp. And we didn't let civilians in our camp, including immediate family of our own staff member. He was a UN staff member and he couldn't get his family in, and they were all slaughtered just in front of our border of our camp. So, has anything changed? I know that there are many instances where UN does a poor job, that we could and we should do more and better. But on the other hand, when I see what we have done in South Sudan, I see that we are moving forward. We were facing a situation that the conflict between ethnic groups, between Dinka and Nuer, was escalating. There was a manhunt against ethnically identifiable group that was spreading around the country. This time, we opened gates of our camps. And at the moment, we are hosting 200,000 people on our compounds. They were never meant to host people and to provide for them safe haven. I visited Bor, where we didn't have more than 1 liter of water per day during the heat for each resident of our camp. I visited Bentiu. I've seen people who underwent amputations without even sedative, not to speak of anesthesia. And similar examples of horrific situation on our UN compounds. However, I would estimate that we have saved tens of thousands of lives. Sometimes we paid the price. Sometimes we were not efficient. Sometimes some people were dragged from our camps and killed. Sometimes our camps were overrun and peacekeepers were killed as well as protected persons. Now, something that you will like, we had an incident in Bentiu when a minister accompanied by soldiers wanted to enter the camp and take some people out, and a person in charge, our regional head, UN head, has said that he does not accept, and they just pointed guns and said that they would start shooting at UN personnel if we do not do it. And he responded, try and see what happens. That guy is American, an NYPD cop who was borrowed to the United Nations. Now, let me say something on what Dean has mentioned as new development, new protection concepts. And this is something that Secretary General was systematically introducing. And if you promise not to quote me, I'll tell you something we discussed at our retreat of senior advisors this year. We were discussing Secretary General's legacy. And one senior advisor said, well, who could have guessed that an 70 years old Asian would be a champion of empowerment of women and human rights? And we all laughed, but it's true. Ban Ki-moon has done a lot for empowerment of women and for human rights. I'll mention just very briefly, and then I can elaborate if you are interested during the discussion. 3 major human rights initiatives that have been, to quite an extent, now put in place, but still have to be stabilized in order to be sure that they are sustainable and no matter of new Secretary General that they stay influential. First of them is human rights due diligence policy. So it's a complicated story, but I'll make it very short, and if you want, we can discuss it further. The whole idea is that UN cannot be supporting non-UN security forces if there is a likelihood that those forces will be involved in grave human rights violations. To put it simpler, we cannot support, meaning we cannot be training, we cannot be housing, we cannot be feeding, we cannot be logistically supporting, transporting, we cannot provide supporting in sense of fighting together to non-UN security forces, meaning either regional forces or national forces that are likely to commit human rights violations. The idea is not to cut the list of non-UN security forces shorter, but to influence their behavior. So if we have a situation that we think it's likely that some forces may be making human rights violations, we do not just reject their request for support. We say, listen, we would really want to support you. However, you must together with us develop some mitigating measures. For example, provide your soldiers with human rights training. You must replace your commanding officers who do not have a clean human rights record. And I can give you practical examples how we were practicing human rights due diligence in the field. Second concept is human rights screening. And it was introduced, believe it or not, on an experimental pilot base very recently. And it's a guarantee that we will not have, under the UN flag, people who have had grave human rights violations in their past. So when anyone now wants to join United Nations, you want to join United Nations as a UN civilian staff, you will have to sign an affidavit saying that you were never involved in human rights violations. When a member state is sending peacekeepers, they must guarantee by signature of the high level of the Ministry of Defense or somebody else that no one in that contingent has been involved in human rights violations in his previous career. Well, will it still happen that there are some people who were involved and their government did not, or they individually did not admit? Of course, yes. So far, we are doing human rights screening only for top civilian and military positions. But hopefully, we will expand that and we will be doing random checks ensuring that people who work for the United Nations have a human rights background, clean human rights background. Now let me say finally something on human rights up front that has been mentioned. The whole idea is that mass atrocities do not come out of blue, that there are early indicators of potentially development of the crisis and atrocities that may be coming. And one of the best indicators, the canary in the coal mine, are human rights. Human rights violations of specific sort, human rights violations against representatives of certain minorities, of certain ethnic groups, religious groups, are early signs of the potential escalation of mass atrocities. So what to do? Traditionally, UN was having a culture of reaction, not of proactive activities. The whole idea is when we notice that there are some characteristic human rights violations, we should first be better in gathering information and then be better in analyzing those information and using them as early warning, and then finally we must act. We must act in various possible ways. We can be discussing it with the member state and its authorities, what sort of action is needed to prevent deterioration of situation. We can be talking to regional organizations that can be helpful in this regard. And if necessary, we can bring the case before the Security Council. And in doing that, we should not be doing something that previously we were doing quite often, and it's saying to the Security Council what they want to hear. Instead of that, we need to pass to them what they need to know to do their duty, which sometimes is unpleasant, and especially it can be also politically sensitive, because we are not speaking about countries that are already in conflict, but about countries where human rights violations are indicators of the potential conflict. And of course that leads us to the concept of responsibility to protect. Responsibility to protect, basically, just as Dean pointed out, is related to state sovereignty. But the whole idea is that state sovereignty is not only prerogative, it's also an obligation of a state to protect citizens that are on certain territory and in certain jurisdiction, including protection of their human rights. So also, speaking of pillars, the theory of responsibility to protect has three pillars. First pillar is that state itself is responsible for human rights of people on their territory and of well-being of those people. If state is not capable of protecting their citizens from grave human rights violations, from grave humanitarian law violations, then it's a duty of other states to help those states through technical capacity building, through financial assistance, to help them to do that. But in case that it's not a matter of lack of capacity, but lack of goodwill, then it's responsibility of international community to protect human rights of people, even if necessary against the state, their state, that is a human rights violator. Of course, we are now here speaking only about grave human rights violations, and it's always questionable when is such intervention legal, what should be the trigger of such an intervention. That intervention could take different forms. It could take form of, for example, sanctions against that state in sense of smart sanctions, for example, travel ban for leadership, freezing their accounts in the foreign banks, but it can be also economic sanctions, or it can be use of force. Current doctrinal debate is, since 2005, that responsibility to protect should be triggered by the Security Council resolution. So, these are my initial remarks, and I stand ready to discuss together with you either something that is covered by issue that I have raised, but if you are interested in something else related to United Nations and human rights, I would be delighted. Thank you.
It's breathtaking to hear about the scope and responsibility of your role and just the range of issues you deal with and how many parts of the world these are crucial. I want to involve all of you in comments and questions. There are 2 microphones there, which if you raise your hand, we will, yes, if you raise your hand, we'll make sure that a microphone gets to you. I'll ask one initial question is, one theme that you hit on in a few different ways was taking a more proactive posture towards ensuring human rights security, not waiting for the problem or the atrocity to happen. And you mentioned the screening and then some other structural changes. You also mentioned kind of training both domestic security forces and UN employees and to avoid that. And can you say a bit more of that? What's both the philosophy of the notion that you would be able to train somebody, and what are some specific ways that you train people to avoid human rights?
You know, when I joined United Nations, I was shocked to find out that not even in Human Rights Office you are not provided human rights training. You are expected to know it by yourself. And in fact, not even in the United Nations, all United Nations staff is not informed about human rights. I think that we will, for the first time in the history of the United Nations, in the beginning of 2016, as a part of human rights up front, we will have an obligatory human rights electronic training for all United Nations staff. So you will not be able anymore to work for the United Nations without knowing basics about human rights. It was so funny, we all had to know something about security basics, and you couldn't work, but about human rights, well, it's a new development. Now, the whole idea is, and I think it's fundamental, that human rights in the United Nations system should not be compartmentalized. That it's not, human rights are not something that Human Rights Office does, but it's core mandate and activity of the United Nations. So every UN staff member, every peacekeeper has to be aware of human rights responsibilities. For the first time in 2015, resident coordinators, they are heading UN teams in various countries, are being selected and appraised also based on their commitment and achievements in human rights area. Concerning human rights and trainings of security forces, I think it's extremely important. And I'll tell you anecdote. I was meeting an elderly Iraqi general, security general. He was working on top posts in intelligence, in internal affairs, as well as in military. And he was working for different regimes, and I have no doubts that he was involved in very nasty things in his past. And I was trying to convince him about the importance of human rights training, and he was looking at me and said, listen, it's too late for me. I have been raised in different spirit, in spirit of obligations and not rights. But when I listen to you, I realize that although I cannot fully understand that those human rights are something that I would like to have for my grandchildren. I will be open for cooperation. So quite often you have that situation that people who want good for future generations in their country are willing to get involved in human rights area, although not fully understanding the concept because of historic circumstances in which they live.
Did I see? Yes, I can. Yes.
Yes. Next month, we celebrate, oh, good. Do I need it? Next month, we celebrate the 70th anniversary of the beginning of the Nuremberg trial of major war criminals. To what extent does your job involve review of the principles of Nuremberg in the human rights area? I'm talking about the prohibition against war crimes, crimes against the peace, conspiracy, and so forth. Thank you.
Human Rights Office is not directly involved in setting up international tribunals, hybrid tribunals, but we are involved in supporting processes of transitional justice. Transitional justice usually has a couple of elements. First of all, it's a recognition that something was wrong. It's truth-seeking. Secondly, second element of transitional justice is compensations to the victims. Those remedies for victims can be either material or recognition of what has happened to them. They can be individual, they can be collective. Third element of transitional justice is justice itself. And it means proceedings against people who were involved in grave human rights violations, whether we speak about genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, ethnic cleansing. Those four are called so-called international crimes. And the last, fourth element is an element of non-repetition. And it's something on which victims always insist. Set up a system that this, what happened to me, what happened to my family, never repeats. So we are not directly involved in setting up tribunals, but we are supporting national efforts to establish transitional justice mechanisms. What we also do is we are quite often involved in fact-finding. So fact-finding is the activity aimed at establishing human rights violations. We do not have the threshold that would make our evidence submittable in the court of law. So we do not have such a high threshold, but we try to identify violations that have happened, and we publicly report on them. And then we request that further activities, including setting up of hybrid tribunals or something, is done in order to ensure that there is accountability. Just a small addition. Sometimes we do our own fact-finding, and sometimes there are some independent commissions of inquiry set up, which are consisting of independent experts, and we are providing services to such independent commissions of inquiry.
Hi, thanks for being here. I guess so my question is, I know that your office has reported on some of the human rights violations that have taken place by the U.S., both domestically and abroad, and I'm curious that in light of this tragedy that happened on Saturday with the MSF bombing attack in Kunduz, Afghanistan, do you think that your office will, publicly condemn that action, or, support its own independent investigation of what took place? Because I know that the MSF, they're trying to declare this as, a war crime itself. So I'm curious as your thoughts on that, since it's so current.
Kunduz case is particularly disturbing one, and I believe that it's too big for us, and I think that it does require impartial, independent investigation, which means setting up a commission of inquiry. Why do I think that? Because, and I will just relay now, not to our own findings, but to statements that are in public domain. First of all, it was a hospital that was targeted. Secondly, 30 minutes after the information that hospital has been targeted, hospital continued to be targeted, which is particularly disturbing. Thirdly, Afghan authorities stated that hospital has been targeted because there were some Taliban elements involved in attacks from that hospital. So all that is extremely disturbing and requests an inquiry. International inquiry, independent and impartial inquiry. So far, US authorities has acknowledged that they were involved in that area, but never mentioning that hospital has been a target, but that it's a possible case of collateral damage. Well, it has to be seen whether it was a decision to bomb hospital or it was a case of collateral damage. In case of collateral damage, was there any recklessness? But this case will not go away, and I think it's best for everyone to have that investigation. And of course, that if there is any responsibility either for recklessness or for the decision to target hospital, that it is an individual responsibility. Otherwise, it's already having a negative impact on the ground.
Yes.
Hi, I just wanted to know what your office relationship is, working relationship with groups like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and similar groups. How do you work with them? Is it a formal thing? Is it informal? How does that go down?
We work with them a lot, both formally and informally. For example, wherever I go for a mission, I have first meeting in New York with a couple of most relevant international non-governmental organizations. And then I meet their representatives on the ground. Usually they also ask for debriefing when I return about my findings. So cooperation is very close. What would be the difference in the way that we approach things? I think that international NGOs can be faster than us. They can be faster because their threshold of evidence, their method of verification is less demanding. So if they are 80% sure that something happened, they can speak up. We need to do more verification. On the other hand, our competitive edge is that we have direct access to the, for example, Security Council. And we can address Security Council with our concerns. So I don't think that we are competing, but that we are a part of the same human rights team, and we can best play together if we are using our comparative advantages.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. My question is, I was watching an interview of yours where you said the situation in Central African Republic is a potential threat of genocide, but not yet an immediate danger of genocide. So I lead that to, what are the implications of such a situation for the doctrine of R2P? Can the doctrine of R2P address such a preemptive situation? And if not, then what can the United Nations and the global community do to prevent such a situation from becoming into a danger and ultimately into a genocide?
I visited Central African Republic at a very early stage of the conflict when Seleka were in power. So Seleka were at the time successfully defeating National Army and taking control and being involved in illegal taxation, in plundering, in raping, in killing of civilians, and it already had some both ethnic and religious dimension. And at the time I met with religious leaders, both Muslim and Christian. And what is striking is that Muslim leaders were aware that such behavior of Seleka will lead to retaliation in second phase. So it was a tragedy in making. Now, what did Security Council do what the United Nations do? There was a peace mission established in Central African Republic. It took some time. It was first not UN mission, but there were some African member states sending their troops. It took too long time. Many mistakes were made, and many very hard dilemmas were faced. For example, at the time when pendulum shifted to the other side, when there was a retaliation on so-called Balaka against Muslim populations, including targeting civilians. We were in a very difficult dilemma whether to help to remove Muslim population out of dangerous zones where they were exposed to danger. And it's very tricky, because doing that you're also contributing to ethnic cleansing, and that's exactly what Balaka wanted. They wanted to get rid of civilian Muslim populations in those areas. And we were deciding on a case-by-case basis. If we were in a situation that we didn't have sufficient forces to be able to protect Muslim population at the time to stay where they are, we involved in evacuations. Wherever we could, we tried to establish a situation for them to protect them and to stay there. Now, unfortunately, you are right that once again we are having an escalation in Central African Republic. I hope that now we have a sufficient number of troops on the ground and that we will be able to provide protection of civilians.
Yes, thank you. There have been various instances in where peacekeeping missions caused civilian harm, maybe not directly, but for instance the compensation claims of the Haiti cholera plague in Srebrenica. One could argue that by the UN invoking its immunity, they effectively foreclose a victim's right to an effective remedy and the right to be heard. Do you think with the new recognition of the Secretary General to have human rights cutting across all organizations of the UN, that this could also lead to being a tool for victims in claiming their compensation?
I think you are completely right. When speaking about human rights advancements in sense of human rights due diligence policy, screening policy, human rights up front, missing piece of a puzzle is increasing accountability of peacekeepers themselves. It could be related to cholera. I think that UN's response in this respect wasn't a good one. I think that emphasis should be much more victim-centered and not just defending organization. But there are also a number of less visible cases of, for example, sexual violence and abuses committed either by peacekeepers or UN civilian staff. And those are horrible things. It's not just cases of classical rapes, but there are cases like that. But you also have situations when people in need are being exploited and that sex is traded by women or children for just a ration of food. And are we good in addressing these things? Not good enough. I think what should be an improvement. What we do is that we, in this situation, we do not have real legal instruments. This is first. And secondly, there is now enough frankness and determination to address the issue. Frankness and determination means that we still have some cases of cover-up, do not rock the boat, but also there isn't adequate legal framework. The principle is that law follows the force, meaning that if you have national contingent in certain country, neither United Nations nor national authorities of recipient state can prosecute a person who, for example, was involved in rape in Haiti. So what you do as United Nations is that you call the national government of a member of contingent. We had a case of, for example, Uruguay contingent, and asked them to conduct investigation. I mentioned Uruguay case because government of Uruguay has done a decent job. They really came and they prosecuted the responsible person. But many governments simply do not do it. They prefer to withdraw their forces. We can kick them out, but then we cannot control criminal proceedings. What I think should be changed, we cannot change the principle that law follows the force. What we can do is that we could insert into memoranda. There are always memoranda between United Nations and troop contributing country. We could insert provisions that a country who is contributing troop is accepting that United Nations or national recipient authorities could take necessary measures to preserve evidence, and that they accept that such an evidence will be submittable in the court of law of the troop contributing country. To make it practical, that United Nations, because we have as part of our peacekeeping forces, we have a lot of police, some of them having experience. We can interview witnesses, we can preserve forensic evidence, and well, it takes some time for national police officers from the troop contributing country to come. And they come in some 7 days, 10 days. Well, then we present them with evidence. We present them with a list of witnesses, with their statements, with forensic evidence. It's still responsibility of government of the troop contributing country to handle criminal proceedings. But then it's much more difficult for them to avoid responsibility, because it's quite obvious that crime has taken place and there is evidence of the crime. So we can do much more in sense of naming and shaming such country, or to exclude such a country from list of troop contributing countries. So I'm campaigning for that to be included in future provisions.
Mr. Šimonović, you shared with us the fact that Secretary Ban Ki-moon's legacy will be defined by what he has done for women's empowerment. And I do share that sentiment with you and your colleagues, but at the same time, 30 years after Security Council Resolution 1325, which asks for women's leadership in peace negotiations, only 7% on average, women constitute only 7% of peacemaking treaty bodies and delegations across the world. And in the 100 or more peace treaties that have been forged after the end of the Cold War, women have constituted less than 2% of those at the table in peacemaking. And not a single woman has led a peacemaking delegation. So given that track record, the UN really does not and cannot claim the mantle of leadership in peacemaking as far as women's leadership is concerned.
I agree with you. I think that there is a long way to go in this area, and it's not just a question of equality, it's a question of efficiency. I have talked to women in all conflict situations and discussed with them the importance of their role. Women have a lot to offer in sense of such negotiations. When I compare the attitude of women, it is much more future-oriented as custodians of life on the planet of Earth. Women are natural core component of peace negotiations of every conflict. I do think that speaking of Secretary General, that he definitely has changed the number of women on senior advisors' posts. So far, the most resilient enclave of discrimination against women have been peace negotiations. However, he has appointed now repeatedly in some very difficult country situations women as a special representative of Secretary General. Hilda Johnson in South Sudan is replaced by Margaret Loeb, another woman in South Sudan. In many other countries we had women representing United Nations in tough situations. We had female commander until recently of the police force. We are having first female commanders, field commanders of the UN peacekeepers. Still, the issue of female UN mediators and special envoys is lacking. But it's a work in progress. I believe that in the foreseeable future we shall be changing that ratio.
Secretary Šimonović, I want to thank you for coming. It's remarkable listening to you how your role both fuses and what you've shared with us both fuses the very kind of high-level conceptual aspiration toward human rights, but also a really rich account of institutional dynamics and practices that you're working on within the UN and with some of the states you work with to implement those. I think, for instance, when you were talking about the way you view your office's role vis-a-vis the Security Council as giving an independent voice resonates deeply with some of our own constitutional debates about, say, what the Attorney General's role or the White House Counsel's role is in giving the executive branch advice. It's even applicable to kind of company general counsel or compliance industries like pharma, and as such, I think connects deeply with the role of lawyers and institutions around the world. So it's really been a pleasure having you here. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Thank you, Margita, for helping to bring this event together, and we really appreciate having you here.